Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Our Creative Connection podcast. I'm delighted to welcome someone to this episode who is the founder and director of Nurture Development, a member of the ABCD Institute, DePaul University in Chicago, internationally renowned trainer, facilitator, public speaker, author, and I'm very pleased to say, my friend, Cormac Russell. Welcome, Cormac.
Thank you, Chris. Good to be with you. Good to have the opportunity to have a conversation together.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming on. So it's obviously, great to have you on the show, but we know each other anyway, so it's doubly good just to catch up in conversation. How would you describe what you do, Cormac?
Well, Chris, mainly I think it's getting alongside or, being a companion to people who are either trying to build community, I suppose, as neighbor, as resident, as somebody who cares about their local place. And I suppose the second category of people, if you like, would be people who are trying to realign either their profession or their institution or both to a more community-centered way of working. So a lot of our institutions are probably quite badly aligned. They're more aligned to the institutional mission than they are necessarily to the desires and the priorities of community. So we occupy that kind of funny space between those respective worlds and try to be useful outsider and an alongsider to those conversations.
You work all over the world. Pre-COVID, that would have meant sort of physically traveling to places, and then during COVID, that translated into an online experience for people. Are you doing a mix of online and in-person stuff
it's
now?
very much hybrid now. So I suppose there's that element at which there are things you just simply can't do except via the in-person group work experience, and that's key. So, we don't try and do online what you have to do on land, but there's a lot of stuff you can do online through self-directed learning, through, as you know, we're doing it now, through conversations and indeed through facilitated training and mentoring. So our offer is much more hybrid, and we're kind of taking people really in terms of the more traditional way of thinking about progression through training. We offer training in asset-based and strength-based practice, so what I would call community animation. And we're taking people really right through from introductory to more intermediate and on into now train the trainer offers. So which is very exciting, So we work in, I think overall there's portfolios in 38 countries around the world now. Wow. And the ideal would be over the next 10 years that I very much relocate authority to those countries and very much practice what we're preaching, which is leading by stepping back. Obviously there if we're needed, but very much trying to build that capacity in community, in country, in region. Yeah.
Could we unpack some of the terms that you describe in there? Because I think people listening would find it useful to hear, your how you describe these terms, sort of asset-based community development, strengths-based working that you describe, strengths-based practice. How would you define these things?
Well, I think starting with asset-based community development, without getting into too much of the weeds on it, it's basically a description of what people do resident to be effective and to be powerful. So if you kind of take that principle that really to get to social justice, to get to better outcomes for people, there needs to be a radical redistribution of power and of wealth, of equity. But also then there needs to be a lot of power to take that on at the community level. That doesn't just happen. We've got to build those relationships and that power, that agency, that carrying capacity. So I think recognizing that ABCD says, well, the A is for asset, so that there are capabilities, there are resources within communities, but they've got to be discovered and connected and ultimately mobilized. But that isn't just about grassroots. That's also about recognizing that there may be things that need to happen from outside in as well. So it's really kind of figuring all of that out. So all of that of a cluster, of a bundle, is called asset-based community development. So starting very much with what's strong in people's lives. And that starts, by the way, could be with, I often think it's with, well, what do people collectively desire? And they may not know that until they actually collectivize, until they get from a kind of a very isolated, maybe sense this is just my problem or this is on me, to actually this is a we possibility. And it's not just on us, but if we collectivize, we can really change the nature of conversation, both internally, with neighbors, with other associations, and externally, So you kind of get to that point of the features of asset-based community development tend to be local, because people tend to kind of organize best, particularly if they've been oppressed or they've been traumatized, or there's some level of injustice. So clearly there is, right, for a lot of communities. Then the more local and the more sort of within the sphere of their influence you can be in your work, probably the better. And you're building that up to get to the point where they can begin to challenge outside agencies if that's what's needed. But in the nub of it, you're sort of saying there's certain things that communities can do together collectively. There's really not a lot that's needed there, except maybe remove the bureaucracy and give them enough space to organize, to figure that out. And then there are things that people will need help with at the local level, So people use terms like co-design and co-production or whatever. But I mean, in essence, what we're talking about there is there a respectful relationship where the people who are kind of trying to get alongside communities see themselves as there to supplement, not supplant, community agency, community desire. So that's the second kind of, you think about it like a 3-lane swimming pool. The first lane, what can people do themselves, and how do we remove the barriers to that, and even just listen to people in that very active way, and treat them like they're doers, treat them like they're people who can create. This is a big problem, Chris, because so many outside actors are coming in and they're not seeing people as doers. They see people as a bundle of needs, a group of patients or potential patients. So they're using language that's very passive, and often I would say patronizing and paternalistic. So your modality, your mindset is one of, I see citizens, I see agents of change, I see doers, I see creators, I see makers. So, if you're a police officer, you now redefine your job as not policing the bad out of the neighborhood, but inviting the good that is within the neighborhood out, and then supplementing that. So your role as a police officer is either, well, can we, in that second lane, can we do stuff together, right? And that isn't about squealing on your neighbor. It's about, can we address the homeless issue at the fringe of our neighborhood together, for example? What might we do about that? So everybody, including people who are street involved, can feel safe. Can we maybe, instead of one part of the community reporting, like an older part of the community reporting issues around antisocial behavior, could the police get together with some peacemakers in the community and bring the young and the old into conversation? And could we use our resources that way? So that's, and then there will be things like, there will be, criminality, there will be, on that kind of third lane of the swimming pool, there'll be a role for the police officers, which is very traditional. It could be enforcement, it could be something else that's more traditionally their role, like, dealing with a traffic jam or whatever it might be. But the idea really, I think, is that if we can get the sequence right most of the time, and you have to make hay while the sun shines, so this is hard to do in a crisis, but for most of the year, there are opportunities and occasions within which the communities can really just perfect that sort of, what is it we care about, we want to do ourselves, let's crack on and do that. And if you look historically back in the 70s, or you look at what happened during COVID, you see examples of what I'm talking about, where community-led action leads to a better life for people who live there. in all kinds of ways, from health to safety to raising our kids to just having fun to responding to crises like COVID or a flood, right? Then there will be occasions say, God, we could really do with a bit of help here, so the resource or the cheering on or whatever of an outside agency would really extend our capability. And then finally, in the third lane, there are things that we just need agencies to do for us. There are very few communities, and I think even this is true of people who are listening in, who are maybe thinking of themselves as listening as a professional. You could also imagine you're listening as a resident of somewhere. I'd imagine in your community, you'd find it very hard to sell the idea that the community should collect the bins on a Thursday or a Friday or whatever day they're collected. So there are functions that we want agencies to take on. And sometimes people who I think are kind of just maybe really not very clear on ABCD misunderstand that. They kind of think what we're saying is communities should just pull themselves up by their bootstraps and do everything. And sometimes I think there's a willful mischievousness in that, because I don't know how many times we can say, actually, that's not what we're saying. I would not go to a neighbor and ask them to perform heart surgery on my son. It would be ridiculous. But yet, nevertheless, even at very academic levels, you'll get that critique. So it's just one of those things, I think, where sometimes people are making mischief because there's a lot of power dynamics that go in here. Because what we're talking about is the relocation of authority. So if you're a professional or an institutional that really wants a monopoly over people's health or people's safety or people's childcare or whatever, you'll find this very hard to hear, because it's saying to you, relocate authority and put the citizen at the center and then supplement. But for others, it's just a misunderstanding. And we can clarify that up with an explanation like I've just given there.
I loved how you described the sort of the three lanes of the swimming pool, and as you were describing that, that it's so nuanced, isn't it? This kind of way of thinking about things, because the world's nuanced, isn't it? It's complex. There's lots of moving parts, and it changes all the time, and it's never fixed. And I remember, you would always say, when you've seen one community, you've seen one community. You know nothing about the next village or town along, and actually, depending on the time of day that you went, maybe you don't know anything about what happens an hour either side of your visit as well. It's like an ongoing, moving feast. But that nuance is often lacking, isn't it? I think when we talk about, I was in conversation the other day, and these sort of like terms are bandied around: community, volunteering, or whatever, and they're quite all-encompassing, but also quite, lacking of any nuance, aren't they? That it's kind of like, well, what do we mean? Who do we mean? Where do we mean when we use these terms? And I think
absolutely
sometimes that's the challenge for people, isn't it? Actually, we're not thinking about these things in a nuanced way, or I'm not showing up with thinking either that it's not my job to solve everything around here, or the only thing I'm interested in is the agenda that I'm attempting to pursue.
Absolutely. And it is, I'd extend a lot of grace to people because even if you go into a store and you pick up a product, you turn over and you'll see, such and such a community, where I can basically go online and I can join a community of people interested in the Lego set that I'm buying for my children, or the salad that I'm, thinking of buying. So people are using the term community as a catch-all term. So I go to London and suddenly I'm a member of the Irish community. Well, nobody ever told me. Or any other Irish person who could be second generation, third generation, or just landed off the boat or the plane last week. So we kind of use these terms probably with good intent to try to say there's some degree of affinity or affectivity between the people that we're with. But I think it's much more useful actually to really just think about what's my relationship to the people in the place that I'm going into. And as you say, I think bring a lot of humility to that and a lot of curiosity to that, because we simply don't know. Now, if you're in an organization or your practice is measured, key performance indicators dictate that you have to go into a place and make it legible. You're immediately moving into a place with the intention of manipulating or trying to in some way engineer the relationships. And so I think an awful lot of community engagement is predicated on go out and recruit clients for this service, which of course is not what it's meant to be about. Community development, which I think is a better term actually, or community building, or even community organizing. Their intention is first find out what community cares about. And that's difficult, you see. I think then, you're off road, so this idea of I'm going to go in and I'm going to make legible and I'm going to make clear within a 3-year cycle what it is I said I would do has to be taken off the table. And this is massively compromising for people who are really expected to corral the community or a subset of the community into a very defined patient or, volunteer or whatever it might be. So what we're asking people to do is to do something which their institution may in fact be asking them not to do. And that's where all of the dilemmas come to surface. But I think the reason that people are interested now, even at the institutional and strategic and policy levels in ABCD, is because they're recognizing that story is run aground. The story that says an institution can have a monopoly on an individual, family, or community's health or well-being, and they can go in and engineer or manipulate people into a set of behaviors or a lifestyle that will make their life better, is really quite counterproductive. So it doesn't even give the institution what it wants. It creates the very opposite of what's intended. So I think there's a growing awareness, albeit that we have to see every generation, we have to remember it again and retrain people in it. But there's a growing awareness, I think, that we've hit the limits of what an institution can do top down.
I've got two thoughts in my mind. One is looking backwards and thinking about sort of like your entry into this way of doing and being. But I'm really interested in what you just said about the reaching that limit of organization's ability to, like you say, even if the intention was we just want you to go out there, be super helpful, help everyone out of the need to actually do anything for themselves, that idea is sort of run aground. Do you think that was the impact of COVID has played a role within that, not just sort of on a budget level, because I think a lot of services can't afford to be the most helpful service in a particular place, but do you see things playing out slightly differently? Because we worked together a lot pre-COVID and then during COVID. I'm interested in particularly sort of your sense of things as we came out of that pandemic sort of situation, and then is there a new normal? Did we revert back to the old normal? Like, what's your sense of how that power dynamic has played out?
Just in relation to COVID, I think what would have happened is that, in a matter of weeks, really, once the lockdown started to kick in, it became really clear, and I'm kind of doing with my hands here a hydraulic effect, it became really clear that what would have been pre-COVID the reality, where the role of the institutional was in the ascendancy. At the, you imagine that this is a hydraulic pump and there's two pistons, one is down, the other is up. And I think the role of citizens was very much in retreat. The role of citizens and associations, very important. I see a lot of people talking about citizens and they don't mention associations. Associations are really important because associations, the collective noun for citizen. So you have a solo singer, you have a choir. It's the choir that actually builds community, not the individual hero or the individual citizen. So it's really, really important. This is why we have certain people who are advocating, just citizens forums are the answer. They're not, actually. They're a part of the answer. but also in associational life, whether it's, clubs, groups, football, whatever people are into, or in neighborhoods. What we started to see was a lot of associations, even if they couldn't be physically present, we're kind of reaching out and checking on each other. So exercising together online, the Weight Watch group or whatever it might be. And so we saw, in a sense, I think that the lockdown really kicked in and kids were, not going to school. And, we had a neighbor who died who would have otherwise been in a hospice, but was actually died at home. So I think what we saw was a lot of the institutional functions that would have been up here. So our neighbors were going to them, right? And we had nothing to do. And even if we did, we weren't around. We were at work or whatever it might be. Suddenly that equation flipped. And from a situation where the institutions were in the ascendancy and we were in retreat, it was the reverse. We were banging our pots for, the NHS on a Thursday night or the equivalent in whatever country we were in. But we began to realize, I think, as local neighbors, we had to watch out for each other, even if it was, we had to be together apart in a sense. And, that became very, very clear, the importance of that. And the actual practical manifestation of that, in parishes on the Isle of Man. You'll remember, Chris, we were kind of, hearing stories of groups of people walking up and down the street every couple of hours, and they had a traffic light system. Red meant, I was in danger, I needed help, so somebody came, and orange meant all is good, kind of keep going. Green meant maybe I needed some shopping or whatever, So, or vice versa, I can't remember the codes. Probably green meant keep going. So, but it was all this local inventiveness that we saw, which I think in a lot of ways, like we saw with, a lot of the donors were saying, we trust you, crack on, do what makes sense, let us know if you need anything. So I think that impulse actually, it forced what I describe as the 3-lane swimming pool, right? So pre-COVID, I think a lot of institutions were stuck in the 3rd lane. That was the conversation. What can we do to you and for you? During COVID, the institutional world it didn't just hit the limits of its capacity. It was confronted with the reality that it didn't have to face pre-COVID, that actually you're a lot more limited than you think you are. So it exposed, I think, both the limits of our institutional world and the importance of getting to know our neighbors before we need them. And so the story changed. We are the first responders. Our neighborhoods are the first line of response, was the new normal. And of course, institutions matter. We're not saying otherwise, but they really took on a very supplementary role. So in that hydraulic metaphor that I'm using, what you saw was the institutional world came down. Not always desirable now. I'm not lauding the virtues of that, because there's a balance to be struck here. But community came up. I would say very quickly, once lockdown was lifted, actually an awful lot of our institutions used the harm, the level of mental health challenges and so that were part of lockdown to validate their not alone ascendancy, but their meteoric ascendancy. So they would almost argue that this proved just how much more the professions were needed. Now, I've nothing against the professions, nothing against the institutions. The issue here, and what I'm critiquing, is monopoly. So I think that monopoly, pre-COVID, which we collude with, we constantly outsource an awful lot of our citizen functions, like health, for example. 85% of what determines our health relates to my agency and my associational life, as well, of course, as the environment and my economy. So I want to make that clear. It's an equity piece. And there can be no health and wellness without fairness. But I think post-COVID, we're almost back to this ridiculous equation again, this malalignment or this misalignment. So I think what we're seeing in our work is that some institutions that are agile and maybe haven't passed their own watershed have really cottoned on. They've learned from COVID. They've listened to communities. they've paid attention. But I think what maybe is more likely is a lot of institutions are recognizing the limits of what they can do because of budgetary cuts. And there are some that are still in the argument, we need more money, and if we have more money, we'll be able to provide more service and all will be well. I think that is probably, that lacks nuance, because there's some element of truth in that. We wouldn't want to fall into the argument of a kind of a let me say a right wing or an extreme right wing view of things. So we're not talking about small government or big government. We're talking about proportionate government. So we don't want governments in our bedrooms, but we don't want them completely out of our lives either. So, and actually it does depend on the situation and the context. So, I think hopefully what we're now beginning to realize is that in the face of a polycrisis, where we will probably by 2080 be living in the reality of 3-degree neighborhoods. So this idea of 1.5 being net zero, I think even in over the next 5 years now, the World Health Organization is saying that one and perhaps all 5 of those years will see us exceeding that. So I think we're moving, and it's not to be doom and gloom, but I think we're moving to a situation where we can no longer think about health and safety and the environment and raising our kids all as separate silos. They are all of a piece. For example, we know now that if you take all of the interventions of the health world, the hospitals and so on and so forth, and they were one country, they would be between the 4th and the 5th highest polluters of the planet. So this is relative to countries, right? Wow. So here our health interventions, our institutional health folks who should be making us healthier are actually polluting our planet, which is making us. This is an example of moving beyond our threshold or our watershed. You get beyond the watershed of what you can do as an institution, and you start creating toxic outcomes. So we have to try to figure out, Chris, is okay, what's the world teaching us? What's the planet teaching us? And it's teaching us that this isn't just about making sure everybody has everything that they want. It's about how do we actually create well-being in a good life, which allows us move lightly on the planet with equity. And clearly, the grotesque reality of being a billionaire, like being a billionaire is a failure of that equation, right? So there's a question about equity and about distribution of wealth. And that's on the government. Communities can't do that. But we can organize to hold, including, you take the UK context, challenging and teaching the leaders and teaching politicians. Like in many respects, I think a lot of communities during the recent riots, which were stirred up by bad actors. But it was, it was a very interesting kind of journey over a few days where in the very early stages, you had bad actors who were essentially trying to seed the racist rhetoric to define the country in those terms. And, I was watching the coverage actually in Spain. So, this coverage was being broadcast all over the world. And then the second story was the story of the hero. We're going to come in and we're going to police these people out of your neighborhoods and we're going to punish them. We're going to hold them to account. But the third and the most compelling story was when the community said, not in our name. And the community said, we are more than you are, and we're here, and it's our community, and we define it as a place of welcome. And I think that was the most compelling. So you literally, over the course of 3 days, you could test which of the 3 stories carry greatest currency and are most compelling. And it's the community story. So in the face of this, the racists hit the limits of what they could achieve. The hero politician and the police hit the limits of what they could achieve. And the communities had to come in and say, enough's enough. Now, actually, it's also important that the enforcement is there to back the communities up, keep them safe. So, it's a really interesting thing. But I think what it shows is the police can't do it on their own. The doctor can't do it on his own. The teacher can't do it on their own, etc. So where's this role for community? And I think that's what we're beginning to be reminded of again. And I wonder whether pre-COVID we had really forgotten that and become almost just consumers individually and actually collectively, but also quite disconnected. I don't know if you feel that, Chris, but I think communities had become places that were quite atomized and where people weren't necessarily as connected as they might have been when you and I were growing up, for example.
I love the idea of a good life, and I draw on a lot of the asset-based community development sort of methodology and ways of thinking about things, ways of looking at things, and that idea of a good life was certainly one of the questions that we used a lot when we were doing ABCD sessions, and now in the work that I do now in sort of participatory photography, it's a question that I use a lot because I love how open it is and people can interpret it in lots of different ways. And it encompasses so much. So thinking of those three lanes that you described as, sort of perhaps community orientated, service orientated, and then in between stuff that, we need to collaborate on, it can account for all of that. And I use it as a way of helping people. Sometimes I think people are dealing with stuff that they might find tricky to put into words, or often, the only language that exists for it tends to be the sort of a professional sort of set of words, or, it's not the language of the community. So they're kind of having to borrow this kind of like set of words, which aren't really their own and aren't really the way they would talk in their own life, but then feel that I have to couch it in these, what's a favorite of mine is well-being. That's not a word that anybody really uses outside of the context. You go, oh, how's your well-being today? It's not a question you would normally ask someone. So I find using photographs as a kind of shorthand way of, let me show you what a good life looks like for me in this moment. I'm not tied to it forever. Well, yesterday you said it looked like that, and so it changes over time. But in this moment, here's what it looks like for me. And then photographs, I find, are a really gentle way to kind of unlock, maybe, or just allow for people to say what they want to say. If I describe what this photograph represents to me in a way, I'm sort of expressing things just in a different way, not better or worse than any other. But so I find that it's useful for those individuals taking part, but then also for any helpful sort of entities like a service or a professional to kind of, okay, I'm now seeing what the world looks like from your point of view, and that is a powerful thing too.
I agree. And there's so much in that, the practice. What you're really trying to do and I think this is true in strength-based practice as well. And we're seeing the growth of strength-based practice for many years. So if you look at the way occupational therapists operate now, you'll hear them talk a lot about enablement. If you look at how any of the allied professions, even physiotherapists, it has become very oriented towards let's make sure that we're strengthening the person to be able to be as self-reliant as it is possible and appropriate to be in the context. So, but what each of them are doing is they're trying to foreground the capability, not alone of the individual. And I think sometimes it's over-focused on the individual, but the individual and their peer groups and their networks and their kinship groups, familial groups, and of course their neighbors and community at a wider level. So what I think is powerful about the photographs is it literally actually gives them the opportunity to see what they're placing in the foreground and what they're putting in the background. And sometimes what I think happens to us is when our lives are colonized by, managed services, what starts to happen actually unconsciously is we start to background our own desires, our own capabilities, And so, well, a good life, if I've been given porridge in an institution all my life, a good life might be, porridge with currants in it, or honey in it. Um, so often people don't have the foggiest clue of what a good life is, in that kind of very wordy sort of way. And as you say, sometimes their whole mindset is very focused on what the institution says I can say about my good
Yeah.
life. So anything that I think opens that out and allows them to dream, to picture, to even get beyond the heady way of thinking and maybe into feeling and into context, and I think it creates a much more embodied way of knowing, actually. Um, and so pictures that actually give the person the chance as well to be in the driving seat, to literally hold the camera, to decide where the
Yeah.
focus will be, to be in the context. And I would imagine that the conversation you might have the first time may be very different than a conversation you'll have as trust builds and as you kind of maybe go on a community walk, for example. So you could say to kids, bring me to the places that make your eyes
Yeah.
dance in your head around here and let's take some photographs. And I think that's really, really powerful, actually. So yeah, I love even imagining those conversations that then flow from that. So you could imagine in a school full of kids who've done that, an exhibition where the kids share with their parents and with their, aunties and uncles and neighbors, this is what we value about the place we live in, that actually becomes the foundation for another conversation, and a lot of imagination emerges from there, which is really what pictures are. They're the expression of our imagination as well as the reality of our context.
Yeah, absolutely. And that idea that that they're really the jump off into conversations. We had an exhibition in a community just up the road from here on Friday, and someone was asking me, um, they were saying that I'm drawn to the words. It's the words that I'm interested in. Each photograph has got a description next to it. And sometimes I'll record the audio of our conversations when we're preparing for an exhibition, rather than ask people to write it down because that kind of interrupts it sometimes. So these are so when you read the words, it's literally someone's voice kind of alongside their images. And I always say, it's not a photography project. That's the bit that we're really showcasing is
Yeah.
the expression of what people were thinking and feeling and wanting to share in that
Yeah.
moment.
Beautiful.
The photograph is just a gateway into that. Some people are really creative and put lots of thought and time and energy into the the photograph, but equally it's that more the thought process internally and then collectively within the group,
That's right.
kind of like what do we want to say, or what would I
Yeah.
like someone to know,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
um,
And sometimes this may be helpful for your listeners to hear as well. Sometimes there can be kind of almost like a silent story being shared,
mm,
So the practitioner can say something like, "You've told us a lot about this photograph, and you've identified all the things that are in the foreground, because that's the way you took the photograph, to kind of place the things that matter to you in the foreground. I'm wondering, is there any hidden treasures in the background
mm,
that you'd like to call our attention to now, so we could be curious about them?" And I think what that gives space for people to do as well is to realize in all kinds of very subconscious, on unintentioned often ways, that the things that we push back to the background,
yeah.
in life can actually really be very valuable. But as a consumerism or individuality or, yeah, individualism or whatever, they may not seem as important. So sometimes I think the things that are sort of almost backgrounded in the photograph have the opportunity to be brought through the conversation to the foreground. And I'm very interested in that in communities. I'm
Mm,
really, really more and more struck by that dynamic between the professional world and the community world, that what we have foregrounded in an awful lot of our conversations is what can be consumed. And
mm,
what we've backgrounded is a lot of the ordinary things in life. So So sometimes I think when people talk about what their good life is, they may talk about money and cars and services initially. I don't know if you find this, Chris, but if you stay with the conversation, eventually it leans into relationships and having time with your kids and, other such things. So I don't know if you find that in your work.
Yeah, I mean, the people take these sort of things in lots of different directions, but yeah, the themes that underpin it all are usually, family, friends, the relationships, whether that's within the group. What I find interesting is often people might have taken a photograph with a particular intent, but then when we come back to share together and they start explaining, like they kind of they take themselves off in another direction. And quite often people say, oh, I wasn't really expecting to have said that, but now this is what it means to me, or that maybe I'd got a particular story I wanted to share, but in the process of kind of describing and sharing, it's something else has come out that they've been surprised by, or but that word that you said, the trust piece is so important. You can't just dive into a conversation about this. We're always working with the kind of the level of trust that's there. So where trust is there, where people feel comfortable and confident, yeah, I'm often surprised at how quickly we can get into some big ticket conversations quite easily. Other times, we have to kind of build up to that. And I always say there's no. I worked with. I'll tell you a little story that might elaborate this or describe it. I worked with a group of young people, and one of the themes that came up when we were talking about feedback on the process of having done a photo voice participatory photography exercise, a few of them said that the thing that they enjoyed most about it, that it wasn't a trauma dump, and by that they meant that often when they're asked to tell us how you feel, that it can kind of feel like what's being asked is to tell us how awful things are for you. Yeah. And that almost becomes this kind of like reverse one-upmanship. Yes. Like, well, yeah, okay, yeah. Well, they've got it that bad. Well, I've got it even worse, and well, I've got it even worse. And so they were quite. In fact, they named their entire exhibition "This is not a trauma dump." That was wow. The theme for the whole thing that they decided on, that held it all together. And I couldn't have started with that intent. It's much more about holding that space and allowing us together to kind of create, individually creating a set of images and a set of narratives, but then collectively identifying, well, what's coming out in this process for us, and then what do we want, what would we like, how would we like to invite others to come and experience this, how do we want to frame it for them.
Powerful. Yeah, I think it's so striking, as I listen to you say that often when we're trying to get alongside a group or a community, there's subconscious stuff happening in the power dynamic, actually. And as well as certain things being foregrounded and certain things being backgrounded. So in this case, the purpose of this conversation is to dump your trauma. Also, there's something being assigned and something being assumed in that dynamic. So, it sounds to me like they said, we do not want to be assigned the role of being the sum of our trauma and assuming that somehow this process is either going to be a dumping ground for it or a fixing ground for it, because I suppose to an extent the implication of what they're saying is that we're not broken, or at least we're not here to be fixed, or this process is not about fixing our brokenness necessarily. So then it changes that dynamic around what's being assigned and what's being assumed. Like you said, they named the process. They defined what it wasn't. So they were putting boundaries around your practice and putting the guardrails around what you could do, which I think is both a credit to them and a credit to you as the practitioner. And I suppose when that doesn't happen, just to kind of bring this full circle around so that listeners can kind of get a sense of it, when that doesn't happen, often the reason it doesn't happen is because the outsider who's coming in to help is actually starting with a needs assessment or some kind of a therapeutic lens that can only see the deficiency in those people and is only really interested in harvesting the needs, because that proves that the professional or the agency is required, is needed. And it goes full circle back to what we were saying at the beginning. This is why so many agencies, if they're coming in to recruit clients, are actually often doing more harm than good. It actually hurts people. And I think if there were any good reason why you wouldn't do it, I think that's reason enough.
Yeah, but it's that nuance again, isn't it? It's having the well, first of all, thank you. I didn't say thank you for that lovely compliment you gave me there, so thank you for that.
Very well.
And but yeah, that nuance, or that acknowledging that as the person coming into that space, that you're not showing up as the expert. You're just showing up as coming alongside people and maybe offering up a different way to look at things, or a new way to think about things together, or maybe something that people are really comfortable and familiar with. I mean, it always strikes me actually that in this sort of social media saturated world, we're really comfortable with the idea of sort of taking photographs and sharing them. But yet when we come to a context like, community development, or health and well-being, or whatever approach is being taken, that's like, uh, seems to be like a different way to
Mm,
do things. So I
yeah,
like in encouraging people to think this is something how to do. This isn't a new thing really, taking a
yeah.
photograph and sharing a story, but we're just changing the set of lenses that we're applying to this thing that we already know how to do.
That's really helpful, actually, even just to kind of play with that a little bit. We're changing the lenses idea, because I think regardless of who you are as a helper, you could be a volunteer, you
Uh,
could be a local neighbor trying to help. I think without realizing it, we are all bringing a lens
yeah.
to the issue, right? So, um, and I think, to be honest as well, so we're not over romanticizing community, bad things happen in
Yeah.
communities too. So, and sometimes they're not so bad as to be awful. So, like, for example, there were lots of kind of almost funny, but a bit weird, dynamics happening during COVID, where people were being brought food even though they didn't ask for it. You know, people were
Yeah.
being offered. It was almost like feeding and getting a prescription became the two essential things.
Yeah.
The world would fall apart if they didn't happen. And a lot of people, even at the voluntary level, were pressed into service, and anxious, and felt an urgency around that. But I think it's really helpful, actually, sometimes to kind of put away that therapeutic rescuey kind of, they're broken, I must fix them, they're vulnerable, or they're frail, or they're whatever. So I think in our urgency to try to make sure that people feel valued, that they feel cared for, that they feel looked after, that we just see them as needy. So that's a lens. I see you as needy. But it's the lens, like no lens can take everything in. That by nature, the lens focuses, or maybe it zooms out, but it can never zoom out so far that it can take everything. And even when it does, when it shows us the earth as a pale blue dot, then we lose the detail.
Yeah.
So I think, like, for example, if we zoom in on people's needs, we're zooming out on the fact that they're also needed, that
Mm.
they have contributions. So it's really kind of interesting. Sometimes we need multiple lenses, and we need to be able to move between them. But a lot of Indigenous communities, I mean, you'll know this, Chris, a lot of Indigenous communities, even still to this day, will not permit outsiders to take photographs of them.
Mm.
And in the kind of mythic imagination of how they might think about that, they'd see that as stealing their soul. And actually, even though that might sound very naive or whatever, I actually think there's a lot of truth in that. That if the outsider's coming in and taking a picture in a very
Mm.
defined way of you, in a sense, it's extractive. What are you going to use it
Yeah.
for? I had the privilege of meeting an elder from a community in Canada whose mother had created a beautiful piece of tapestry, and it was being exhibited in a museum in Toronto. But again, there was a whole process of, well, who permitted the museum to do that? Like what was, now thankfully there was a whole reconciliation between the museum and the family and so on and so forth. But something was taken from them,
Yeah.
you know. So I think what I love about what you're describing in your work as well is that the community are choosing the lens. They're
Mm.
taking the photographs. They're interpreting. And as you say, you're a kind of trying to be a useful alongsider who's just gently asking questions that cast some curiosity on us, some gentle, wondering questions. And I think that's the other piece, that what the questions do is they allow us to revisit what the lens may have curated and really begin to think about what does this mean? So the meaning making, and what does it not alone mean to me, but what might it mean to others?
There's almost like in how you describe ABCD, there's a sequencing, and there's a sequencing within the participatory photography stuff where initially I think people are on a bit of an individual sort of journey with it, and then once we, explore things at the comfort level that people choose, however deep or shallow they want to play around with this, there's no expectation of anything other than people share what they want and have
Mm,
fun as well. Um, but in so doing, starts to become a collective shared experience amongst those who took
mm,
part. And that's a really almost like a closed circuit within the group. There's a process that's unfolding. But then once we prepare for an exhibition or a showcase or a party and invite others to come and see, the images almost they stop being they're not owned by the individuals or the collective who created them. They change
they're
and they
gifted
become
out.
something else. Once they're there collectively. So again, it speaks to that idea of the citizen and then the association. The individual
Mm,
images on their own are powerful on one level,
mm,
but collectively, when you see them all and you see how even within the initial photography group, how people have interpreted them in such different ways, and everybody's different perspective is in there, and
mm,
yet when you come in, you're as a viewer. I always say, you and I could look at the same photograph and see something totally different because we're not
mm,
really looking at the
yeah.
image. We're kind of projecting who we are in that moment, our
Mm,
experiences up to
mm,
that moment, how we're feeling in that moment onto it, and then we're getting a sort of reflection of that,
mhm, mhm.
which is really useful as a starting point for a conversation.
Powerfully so. I remember this is going back a long, long time ago now, but when I was working in childcare at a therapeutic level, I would work with families. And obviously, if I was working with a family, it was because of some kind of support needed, So it anything from they were having difficulty communicating to there was, violence in the home or, lots of complex things. But I always found the most moving thing, we used to use video camera with the permission
Yeah.
of the family. So it's say, um, I might say, like a mother might say to me, I'm really struggling to bond with my baby, for example. And so I would go in and say, well, look, uh, what I'd like to do is just sit alongside you. We put some toys out and play with your infant or your toddler, and let's see how that goes. And what I'd like to do is leave the camera run with your permission for no other reason than I think there will be moments that I won't be able to see and you won't be able to see. And that's where the magic will happen. So I'll take off some time to review the camera and just to pick out the moments where you have connected and your child has connected, and we'll build on that. So rather than me telling you how you should do it or sending you off a
Yeah.
parenting course, I'm going to assume that there may be moments of time when you're doing it already and the camera will capture those, but I might not.
Mm.
And one of those moving experiences I've ever had in my life is just sitting there, and when you could bring the camera, because of course you can forward and, pause and freeze frame and show it and so, but when you could bring a mother whose story it was, I have no connection with this child.
Yeah.
And then you can show a moment where when the mother names the child's name and the child looks up for a moment. They catch each other's gaze, and then the mother turns away very quickly. And I can say, now do you see, he's still looking at you.
Yeah.
So I wonder next time what might happen if you paused a little longer and held the gaze. And you literally look to the mother and you see the most, complex situations, tears rolling down their faces, because there in that moment, they've seen something that isn't a therapeutic intervention. I didn't say, look at your child, use the first name, wait. I didn't do any of that, but I said, wow, look at this. When you use its name, and look at that lovely tone, and you got a big warm face, and look, he's looking back at you. Look at his face. What do you see in his face? And she'll look at the picture and she'll say, love. And say, okay, that's great. So now we know that's the truth.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we try to do with communities in our work as well. So I think the ABCD and Photo Voice have a really powerful way of being in a complement to each other, because, people might be saying, how do I do this? What, I kind of get the theory, but what do I do in practice? And I would say, the arts, Photo Voice, they all create the scenario where not alone can the picture be created, but also the picture that challenges the story that's become internalized.
Yeah.
Because if you take it, if there's a kid who's applying for a job and they don't want to put the address of their community down in that job application, well, that tells me something. They're putting their aunt's address from another neighborhood down. They have a story about their neighborhood. Now, if you, through Photo Voice, go out and you do a community walk and you start discovering what's good about our neighborhood, well, now what the kid has to do, and it's a great act of growing up actually, is they've got to check between these two competing stories. And psychologically, you can never hold two opposing stories at the same time. So now there's a dialogue. And if, as you say, you've got a group who's having that dialogue, you say, well, where did this story that I internalized come from? Well, actually, it probably came from outside, or maybe it came from a particularly difficult period in our story as a community, but it's not the whole story.
No.
And suddenly, so I think that portrait challenges the internalization of kind of a cultural trauma, actually, because that's what we're doing, and you're right about the individual. I think individuals carry that trauma, they carry that story, but we could just as easily help them find new stories. So one of the ways that I think about stories is that you've got two kinds of stories. You've got the story that you receive, and often it isn't by your consent, so it's sometimes it's positive, often it's not. But you've also, secondly, got the stories that you reweave. So they're stories that you can take apart, because even negative stories may have some elements in them that you want to kind of take the stitching apart on, but keep the stitching as you reweave your new, more nuanced tapestry. And I think that's where the connection between Photo Voice and ABCD comes in, that you're kind of moving into saying it's not just you and your story that's valued, but you're also of value. So there's something in what you have to give which really needed in this community. Let's discover what that is.
Yeah, absolutely. I always remember when we would do, this is sort of pre-COVID, so in-person ABCD workshops, and I think one of the challenges or activities that we would invite people to get involved in would be to, explore the local surroundings. Let's see if you could find, I can't remember now, it would be things like a story, a local story, or a group, or someone who has a gift to give. And even at that stage, I think, I noticed that those people who came back to the session and they had taken a photograph would often be able to kind of tell a better story, regardless of what the photo was of, but almost just the act of having taken it. It's like, I'm talking about this story now. That stood out for me when I was thinking about this stuff early on. But then I see it play out during exhibitions and celebration events, and and feedback that you get from people is that, you know, it's almost that reminding people that, yeah, you can present whatever story you want, and it can be multifaceted and nuanced. But ultimately, if you're the author of that when it comes to seeing other people see it, like there's a confidence that comes from that. So you see people sort of almost curating their own image and telling people about it or sharing. And often people will say, I think I mentioned this earlier, but they'll say like, I didn't realize that my story would mean so much to somebody else. You know, and people are often sort of surprised at that, you know, that they have this idea that, oh, I don't have something to contribute, or people aren't going to be interested. And then reminding people that others really will be interested and really are moved by things that people would dismiss as not having meaning. But I think it's those everyday experiences that are just as important. You know, the small
Completely.
everyday
Yeah.
acts of kindness, or the small things that make a difference, or just seeing a little window into someone else's world can be the most powerful part of a conversation.
Completely. And again, it's that principle, isn't it, of foregrounding the everyday ness of life, and that for so many people, particularly if they've become isolated, those small moments, those small interactions are really, really key. And sometimes it's the small things that make the biggest difference, you know.
Mm.
So, the particularity of, you know, I went out, I had a community walk, I met this person, here's a photograph of her outside her house,
Yeah.
at the wall where we had the conversation. Um, it's the opposite of what we often do when we talk about communities, where we talk in generalities. And what you're describing there is just talking in specificity, talking
Mm.
in the particular, or put it more plainly, it's personal. Now,
Mm.
it's very hard to now start treating this person in an instrumental way or as the sum of what I think is their need, because they have a story. And
Mm.
it's very hard once you know somebody's story in their context to start reducing them into a kind of a siloed unit of need. And I think also, probably be fair to say, it's much easier to see them as somebody who has something to offer to other challenges in the
Yeah.
community as well. You can put the pieces together.
I wondered what's next for you. You've written several books, the Rekindling Democracy. There's Looking Back to Look Forwards as well, which was a sort of a history of asset-based community development. Rekindling Democracy, looking at the sort of big picture. And then I know you've got the Connected Community, which is more bringing it into the
Mm.
hands of practitioners and a sort
Yeah.
of a practical kind of guide. What's next for you, Cormac? Have you got other books in the works, or?
Well, there are other books in the works, but I think, you know, the intention, as a practitioner is I really want to relocate as much of the authority out of nurture development, and certainly out of my domain as possible. And I think some of that is about really legitimizing the next generation of practitioners.
Mm.
So we're putting a lot of effort into what that needs to look like in practical terms, because many of the people who work in organizations will need some kind of progression route. They'll need, you know, training that has credibility as well as credentials. So we've been working a lot, kind of piloting quite a lot over the last 3 years, and I think have a very good offer. You know, that very much being curated and co-designed by practitioners at the coalface, but also by policymakers and, you know, people at different phases in an organization's reality or life journey. So I think the big piece there, the kind of headline is we're really leaning into a train the trainer offer. And I'd love to see across those various countries over the next 10 years, thousands and thousands of really, really deep, discerning practitioners just cracking on with it. So very much working towards our own redundancy. So there's that. We should create a lot more time for writing and or growing tomatoes or whatever life throws at me. but also time for me, for my family. I have granddaughters now, so more time with them, and being in my community, because that's the other side of this, right? So, we were talking about community there, and then we talked about organization, but of course, people operate between both often, and yeah, we need to keep some reserves, as they say in the States, keep some gas in the tank for our good life outside of the
Yeah.
institutional realm. Um, and so, yeah, I got to practice what I preach. So the next book that I'm working on now and researching is going to very much focus on kind of a couple of core questions. One is, what does helping mean if it doesn't cause blowback or harm? What would it look like? How would it be different than a lot of what we're seeing? And I mean that in the sense of anybody who is community facing. So that could be, I don't know, it could be somebody who doesn't even think about what they're doing as having an impact in
Yeah.
community, but they have a vast impact in community. Be a politician, you know. So anybody whose work is community facing and thinks that what they're doing is somehow it's going to have an impact on people's lives. The second piece that's really, kind of leveraging off this question of what does harmless help look like? The second piece is then what does practice itself look like? If we think about, is there kind of like a universal set of practices? I don't want to kind of create uh, a world or a God view of, what we should or shouldn't do. But are there kind of common practices that, regardless of whether you're a fire officer or a pastor or a community artist or a teacher, whatever, that they're just certain principles almost and practices that you would want to engage in? And I think we've kind of touched on some of them already.
Yeah.
Be thoughtful about what you're foregrounding. Be thoughtful about what you're unintentionally backgrounding. Are you
Yeah.
foregrounding yourself as the expert, backgrounding the experience capabilities of communities? Um, be careful about what you're assigning, what you're assuming. So that's the next adventure, and that's pretty much well underway. Even I have a working title for the book. So yeah, and as you said, and thank you for the way you curated the books, because you're right. The various books had, I think, various kind of hopes or intentions. So that very first one, looking back, that was a kind of an oral history project, really. So that was sitting with the founder of the ABCD Institute, John McKnight, who's 93 years young this year.
Wow.
And I was aware back in 2014, 15, 13, it could have been as far back as 2013 I did it. But just there was no actual written history of asset-based community development in the sense of what was the heritage. And now there's more to be written,
Yeah.
the way it was the first conversation. But what we didn't really capture was all of the kind of, like we talked about, 9 very influential people in John McKnight's life. But you can imagine there are thousands and thousands of people who don't get a mention. So I think in our most recent book that we co-authored together, it was that attempt both to lift up stories of regular communities and then give people a little bit of a compass to get their bearings if they're, serious about doing community building. Rekindling is that one in the middle. It's more kind of a philosopher's guide to community. And I think, maybe policymakers and whatnot
Yeah.
might be drawn to that. This book that I just mentioned a few moments ago, I think this is hopefully a book for anybody who is curious about how I can help. So it could be as relevant to a parent or somebody who's caring for a relative, as I guess it would be for a community development practitioner or a volunteer.
I love that. I love that because I mean we perhaps from our experiences will recognize that to be true, that that actually there isn't really a difference if there's not a but for some folk I think there's a real mental sort of dividing line between sort of, oh well, that's how things should be done. And I always use that example of in the UK we had children's centres which came along and almost landed from outer space in some cases. There was a big building plonked in a community, and at a stroke, sort of, either disrupted or destroyed some of the informal community-led stuff that was going on around sort of childcare, but then also kind of started on the premise like, you're doing this wrong, that you need to be trained in how to do it right, and almost, there's a right way and a wrong way, and if you've got a lanyard, you're doing it the right way, and if you're just doing it for free, you're not. And that still
valuable.
persists, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. And even how we think of words like amateur
Yeah,
hour, that's amateur hour, which is a put down. But actually, parenting is amateur. It's an amateur. Most of the scientific discoveries have been discovered by amateurs, bird watchers, photographers, etc. So amateur is really important. We think of the word primitive, which comes from the word primal, the first. They were there before us. We should respect them. We're a guest in their lives, but we say primitive is ignorant, stupid. We think of Neanderthals as if they were somehow, we think of ourselves often as the high watermark of success, when in fact it's far from the case. And in fact, history really teaches us that we're living in it, like historically, we're living in an age that's probably really struggling and gasping for breath in terms of what's next, So I think all of those things, where we're actually really thinking about, hey, hang on a second here, what was there before me, and how can I be a good guest in service of them is really, really key. And that's all we're really saying. I think whether it's photo voice or, if you're coming in from outside, you're an invasive species, whether you like it or not. And you better tread with great care, especially if you weren't invited in. Because the percentage that, of chance that you're going to do harm is very, very high, way, way higher than that you'll do good. So that principle of first do no harm is key. And then, hopefully as trust grows, you might actually do some good as well. But to your point around starting with what was there already, what are the natural inventions that people have already figured out? Who are the positive deviants when it comes to childcare? They're the practices that I really want to lift up in the new book. So basically what I'm saying is that every professional has a technical competency. Say I'm a surgeon. I'm not going to argue that if a surgeon has to do the kind of level of specialized work that they do, by goodness, you want them to be technically competent as well as gifted, almost an artist at what they do, if you like. So there's that world, right? But they also have to be able to talk with people, even to the point of where the person may say, you know what, I actually don't want to go ahead with surgery here. There's a lot of people, very gifted surgeons who will say to patients as they consider treatment, I really think surgery isn't the answer. So in all kinds of ways, what they're having to do is they're having to lean into an affective rather than effective set of skills, which is about trust. The difficulty, I think, a lot of time, and it breaks my heart, is how little time with teachers, with clinicians, with engineers we spend saying, folks, probably 80% of the time you spend will be spent speaking with your colleagues, speaking with partners, speaking with the community. That should be your foundational practice. And then on top of that, we'll layer technical practice. Because 80% of why you won't get your skills used will be because of a failure in communication or community building or trust building. So, that's what I'm hoping the book will be able to convey and lean into. I know there's lots of other people who are doing great work in that space as well. But what I'm hoping to do is to convey that isn't just about a one-to-one therapeutic competency. It's actually about having the ability to see you're talking at an environmental, ecological, and community development level as well. So those skills, I think, really need to be layered in. So hopefully teachers recognize, for example, that the classroom is not where children learn solely or even predominantly, but it's the village. And the classroom is just one supplementary arena within which learning takes place. And then we'll see a very, very different set of skills coming out of our teachers.
It seems, hearing you describe the book, that that we've spoken already, haven't we, about things like community development can kind of get put in a box, and that's where the community stuff happens. And then things like education or health or other things have their own boxes. Feels like in this book you're stepping outside of let's say, the boundaries or the framework of even asset-based community development, and thinking much more broadly about practice. Showing up. How do people show up in the lives of others? And if ABCD is a helpful framework for that, great. But if it's not, then what else
Very
is?
perceptive, Chris. Yeah, no, totally. Yeah, and it probably almost sounds a little bit kind of cavalier, but I've always been of the mind that ABCD, or whatever it is we're talking about, is not the focus. It shouldn't be the focus. The focus
Yeah,
is community, you know. And if whatever it is that we're bringing to bear in the conversation helps open up possibility and open up, hopefully more dialogue, great. But we should never ever make it about the tool.
yeah,
It's all ABCD is a hammer or a chisel or whatever. But and nor should we say that our tool is better than your tool. So
mm,
I think there's something about saying, actually, if we kind of just turn down the volume on all of these models and methods and approaches and
yeah,
say, look, they all have their place, but actually, if you don't understand your posture, if you don't have a set of philosophies and principles, and really just bring your heart to the work, and I know that might sound a little bit woolly, but I mean it genuinely, actually. If you don't bring your heart to the
yeah,
work and your humility to the work, they're just techniques, and actually, they're probably going to come off as choreographed and as fake, as counterfeit.
mm,
So these things, ABCD, whatever it might be, like they're limited. Of course, ABCD is not the answer to all problems, and it shouldn't be, no more than photo voice or whatever.
yeah,
But they are essential, so this is probably key, right? So I think if we kind of think about our practice, and if somebody says to us, describe to me your practice in such a way that I can really understand how you foreground community and how you support the discovery, connection, and mobilization of community capability. And they look at you as if you've 10 heads. There's work to be done. Now, the
yeah,
reality is, I would say, the vast, and it's a bit of a challenge, and forgive me for being a little bit sort of forceful on this, but I think it's important. The vast majority of practitioners, it's not their fault either, could not answer that question.
no,
So, and I think the reason is because they're stuck in organizations that are nurturing their practice. They don't, for example, have a chance to do reflective practice. And this, to your point around the photographs. See, I think the photographs in the organization, literally, if you imagine it, are
yeah,
giving them a chance to reflect on their practice,
absolutely,
literally, right? And in the absence of reflective practice, what actually is happening is, if you say to somebody, tell me about your practice, what they'll tell you about is the event they organized,
mm,
the program they ran, the funding application that they made, the report that they wrote to prove to whoever's auditing that they hit their KPIs. Now, if they're the answers to what are your practice, we're all in big trouble.
yeah,
And if you multiply that across fire officers and police officers and doctors and nurses and every other, community lawyers, etc., if you multiply that, all you're really going to get is little pinches of good grace and individual heart. And I want a little bit more than that. Because I believe that our practitioners actually have a lot more to give if we trusted them, if we supported them, and if we properly trained them.
mm,
Why should community development and all of these other wonderful skills and frameworks only be for people who do community development?
yeah.
Really, I would say every practitioner should have community in their heart. We can train for the rest. So that's the ambition, and you're perceptive to pick that out.
Mm. Well, thank you. So it feels like this is just the beginning of some bigger conversations, exploring, like you say, beyond the realms of the label of asset-based community development, and I'm really excited to see how that unfolds. I'm very, very grateful of your time this morning. We had a couple of technical issues, but we persisted, and I feel like we definitely made this thing happen. So thanks so much, Cormac. I really, really appreciate it.
Enjoy, Chris.
All right, you take care. Thank you.
Thank you.